Comments. Anyway, I'm happy to introduce this panel, and since it is the last panel, I know that I should keep my remarks to very brief ones, and that I should keep our speakers to their time limit, so I will enforce that. I will also enforce that to the speakers who ask questions as well. So with that, I'd like to introduce Hyu, who is an associate professor of political science at Trinity University, just down the road in San Antonio. It's really great to have her. She works on U.S. alliances in East Asia, and has also been a Northeast Asia visiting fellow at the East-West Center in Washington, D.C., an East Asia Institute fellow on peace, governance, and development, and a Korean Foundation fellow, as well as an Abe fellow of the Social Science Research Council. And with that, I look forward to hearing her presentation on North Korea.
Thank you, Rana. Thank everybody for bringing me here to present the beginning stage of my next project. I'm doing something else right now. But I have been thinking about this particular topic, China and North Korea relations, for a couple of years as the North Koreans' provocative actions becomes obvious. And I would like to thank again Sam and Josh for creating this opportunity to have me connect this topic with U.S.-China relations and write about it. To that extent, I would really appreciate any comments to make my paper into a solid paper. These days, I understand that we have to read a Twitter to follow the U.S. foreign policy or the direction of the U.S. foreign policy. So that's what I usually do these days. And in 2017, President Trump said in his Twitter, "They," meaning Chinese, "do nothing for us with North Korea, just talk. We will no longer allow this to continue. China could easily solve this problem." So I was surprised by this statement. I'm going to tell you the reason in a minute, but I hope and I believe that he received well evaluated and enough and proper information about China and China's relations with North Korea before he gave these comments. But the reason why I was surprised is because that his statement in the tweet was actually in line with a well-accepted and a little bit more sophisticated notion among the U.S. foreign policy practitioners in Washington, D.C., that China has not done enough to exert its economic power in restraining North Korea. So the question related to this is it really true? Is it really true that China is not doing enough? And going beyond this question, the logic behind this notion and the notion is that the United States is basically chastising China for the lack of participation in international effort in restraining North Korea. The logic behind is that China has the economic capability or leverage to restrain North Korea. And then the second one is that economic sanctions, although there are a lot of debate about it, whether or not it's working or not, but with the very limited options available for the United States and other countries, economic sanctions seem to be one of the most feasible policies that can change North Korea's behavior. So there are two logics behind this argument and notion. First, China has the economic capability or leverage to restrain North Korea. And the second is, no matter what, economic sanctions is the best policy option right now that can change China's behavior. So then the related questions are, if China has not done enough, why is it? And then the second question is, does China really have its leverage over restraining North Korea? And the third question is, how do Chinese foreign policymakers evaluate the effectiveness of the economic sanctions? How do they view about it? From this notion from the Washington, D.C., it seems that the economic sanctions is the most feasible policy, negative economic sanctions particularly, that changed North Korea's behavior. But what about the China's foreign policymakers' view about this efficacy of the economic sanctions? And I explored, I conducted preliminary research about these discussions and debate going on inside of China by looking at the scholarly journals and the newspapers with a limited time frame. And I found out the following things. I'm going to talk about really briefly about it, and then I'm going to stop my presentation. The first thing is that discussions about whether or not China has its influence on North Korea are scarce within China. They have not talked a lot about whether or not they meaning Chinese, have influence over North Korea. Nevertheless, there are some important elements in the discussion within the China. A few scholars, very few number of scholars, said that China has a leverage over North Korea, but it's really limited leverage over it because of their special relationship. So as long as they can maintain this economic and political relationship with North Korea, which was established during the Cold War, right? As long as they can maintain the relationship with North Korea, China has a leverage, but it is going to have a limited leverage. So then I have a question about what do you mean by limited leverage? And they were never clear about the degree or the feasibility of the limited leverage or economic leverage over North Korea. So what do you mean by this leverage? How do you measure this Chinese leverage? So there's a very limited debate going on or discussion going on about this Chinese leverage. And then secondly, there is an irony in China's relations with North Korea. As other people have argued before in the United States or in other countries, the Chinese relations with North Korea has been deteriorated. And there is an existing consensus within China that agrees with this argument, saying that bilateral relations between North Korea and China became deteriorated for the past several years, particularly for the past several years. After North Korea tested nuclear weapons in 2006, that was the first test, and then this becomes a more and more pessimistic about the future of bilateral relations between North Korea and China because of the North Korea's nuclear problem. But what I was found interesting was that while China recognizes deteriorated relations with North Korea, but China at the same time is concerned about this situation, this deteriorated relations, because it means that China, it's the deteriorated or strained relationship between the two could weaken the China's influence, if any, or even losing the leverage over North Korea in the future. So in order to avoid the losing leverage or losing influence further, China would like to improve the political and economic, or maintain or improve the political and economic relations with North Korea. And Chinese scholars strongly suggested about improving relations with North Korea. I'm talking about this small group of people in Chinese scholars. And then secondly, China's discussion about this responsible great power, 负责任的大国, is actually being played out in China's debate about North Korea and how to deal with North Korea. And there is two versions of interpreting this. One is that as a responsible power, China has to make an effort to comply with international rules and regulations, and particularly UN Security Council resolutions to impose economic sanctions against North Korea. But at the same time, China has to think about its strategic interest in maintaining North Korea as a part of its buffer zone for its strategic interests. So it wants to maintain impose economic sanctions, but at the same time, it should be flexible enough to implement economic sanctions. And what they are talking about, particularly in terms of the 负责任的大国 and the implementation of economic sanctions, is that I found that Chinese believe that how to deal with North Korea's nuclear weapons would be a litmus test for the China's 负责任的大国, responsible great power. If China can handle North Korea really well, with whatever options that it can choose, either economic sanctions or something different. China could emerge as a great responsible power that maintained the stability in the region. So that could be really important for China to deal with. It would be really important for China to deal with how to nuclearize North Korea. But at the same time, 负责任的大国 meaning that you maintain the stability in the region, Northeast Asia, Asia mostly. And China concerned about this increasing tension between the United States and North Korea because North Korea tested missiles and the United States, particularly in the past year, giving the acerbic criticism against North Korea, that rocket man and all that. So that becomes a really serious problem for China. So in order to calm down these two countries, China has to play a very important role to be a moderator between the two. But at the same time, in order to do so, you meaning the Chinese have to be somehow do not push the North Korea to the corner, and then somehow giving this money or investment or the economic interactions flow into North Korea to a certain level so that North Korea can survive. And if that is considered, into consideration, is 负责任的大国 is actually having a double, the two sides of the coin. Right? And economic sanctions. So China's viewpoints about economic sanctions, really briefly, that the China favors positive economic sanctions, of course, economic engagement toward North Korea instead of economic sanctions, because first of all, China doesn't believe in the effectiveness of the economic sanctions, and particularly relying on this previous research about this effectiveness of economic sanctions in 1970s or the Cold War era. Only 20 or a little bit more than 20% of the economic sanctions was successful, and Chinese scholars actually strongly citing that part, and then make an argument that negative economic sanctions does not necessarily work, and instead Chinese have to work on these positive economic sanctions. So in order to briefly try to conclude what I'm trying to say here is that based on these discussions and debates within the China about this North Korea, we can have some these implications on the U.S.-China relations. The first thing is that, of course, North Korea, as many scholars have argued, that it's a common interest between the United States and China. They have to deal with North Korea to some extent. That's a common interest. But if you open up the box and then look inside of what is going on, there is some discrepancy between the United States and China. First of all, from the Chinese perspective, who is going to lead in resolving or solving this North Korea problem? Within China, first group of people, the Chinese argued that it's a U.S. problem. United States has to lead this in resolving this North Korea problem because the United States caused it. The reason why North Korea developed nuclear capability is because of the U.S. military forces in Korea and Japan and in certain North Korea. So the Chinese people say that the United States has to lead it. And the other group basically said that no, it's a China problem. China cannot ignore this problem, and China has to get involved in more and more. But then the related question is, how far can China involve in this process? And if the China get involved as much as possible, and if it complies with whatever United States wants it to do, that means that China get involved in a lot of economic sanctions and all other types of forms, then the China might have to ask the United States or request the United States to give up something for North Korea or for China. So for example, China would request the United States, in order to deal with North Korea issue, China would probably request the United States to normalize relationship between North Korea and the United States, even though the United States is not ready to do so, although we talked about it before. And then China might request the United States to give up the military exercises with the South Korean military, and then perhaps Japan. And China might request the United States to give up the THAAD system in South Korea, all of which might not be favorable to the United States and perhaps to South Korea. And then secondly, and of course, China and North Korea's relations are undergoing major changes. And part of the reason is, from the Chinese perspective, is that North Korea lost its strategic value as a buffer zone long time ago because of the ballistic missiles, from the Chinese perspective. So then the question related to this is that, so how far can China go how far China is willing to let the North Korea go. So I think China currently is stepping in both territories. One is the close alliance relationship. Another one is
Another one, man.
Sorry. It's going toward this normal relationship with North Korea. They're debating about it right now. But at the same time, if you consider this current discussion occurring in China about this U.S. alliance system in Asia, China believes that the U.S. alliance with Japan and South Korea becomes more militarized than before. It's really seriously concerned about this. So if China still maintains this perception about this militarization or severe militarization of the U.S. alliance system in East Asia, China might not be able to depart completely from this alliance relationship toward the normal relationship. So I'm going to stop here, and I would appreciate any comments on this.
Okay, great. Thank you, HJ. Josh said that I was allowed to start with my own comments, so I'm going to go ahead and use the chair's prerogative. Thank you for the paper. It's such an important topic, and not just for the United States, but for the Northeast Asian region. I had just a few comments, questions, ideas to strengthen the paper. First, I really wanted more detail and empirical analysis on how much influence China has. Trade, economics, political transportation links, and thinking creatively, even the flow of goods and currency and things like that. And then two examples of either how that could be influenced or how that could be exercised, and breaking it out in terms of what would the steps China would have to do, how then it would be perceived by North Korea as well. And then you mention it, but I felt like you didn't draw it out, the constraints that China is working against. What would be the consequences if China did X? If China cut off aid to North Korea or food aid, or used a certain kind of economic sanction, what might then happen in terms of either the relationship with the DPRK or DPRK internally? And then in terms of the empirical side of things, kind of getting at the sources you use, and I kind of feel funny saying this in front of a room full of scholars, but don't just listen to the scholarly literature. I think, and Josh and I, having worked in Washington, can see that even though scholars bring a lot of useful things to the table, I think what would be really helpful is interviews with Chinese policymakers. Given the difficulty of often securing those kinds of interviews, then at least kind of going around the think tankers and scholars who might be involved in Track 2 stuff, but at least doing those interviews in country would really bring out a lot more of this. And then some people may disagree with me on this. This stuff about China and economic sanctions, it's just baloney, because China uses economic sanctions. They've used it very effectively in terms of human rights, we won't buy from Boeing, we're going to buy from Airbus, et cetera. And so I think that we need to have a more nuanced discussion in the paper of the range of sanctions, how China has used them in the past, and that China's actually been pretty effective in using it, because they don't see any more UN human rights resolutions. So those are just my thoughts. I'm going to open it up to the floor, and if you could just kind of be to the point and brief. Yes, Professor Sutter, and then I'll go to Minha.
Hey Jay, this is a very interesting paper, very important, and I think what you presented is really good. I'm trying to put it in context. I remember in the past, we've had episodes of Chinese debate about North Korea since, 2009, really 2006 probably. And then you'd have this debate where these scholars and other experts are arguing, and then the Chinese government would do something totally different. And you never really got a sense that the Chinese scholars knew what the Chinese policymakers were doing. You know, for example, Kim Jong-il, he would come to China, he would sit down with Hu Jintao, they would do all sorts of things together for hours, 50 hours. And you go to China and nobody knew what happened in those talks. And then of course when Kim Jong-il got sick and the Chinese they doubled down and improved relations with North Korea. With that, they just put aside this debate and they just went ahead. So you've been looking at this issue for a long time, and I wanted to get your perspective as well. Okay, today the scholar picture, this is very good. I mean, it lays out, I think, where the Chinese are and the rationales of what they're doing. That's what it seems to be. But I want to get a sense from you is this what is your sense in the perspective of Chinese experts in North Korea, on North Korea, Chinese experts on North Korea, often not knowing what the government's going to do. Is that still a problem? And then how it gets to Rana's remarks as well, and how authoritative are these scholar views? How much weight do you put on it?
Oh, I promise Minha, and then we'll go to Professor Zhao.
Mine will be very quick. So the first one is on the economic sanction. I think we speak this term very easily. I'm no expert, but some of the legal professors who specialize on this say that economic sanction by UN resolution is very complicated. So that actually when Washington and we think China violated and China said we didn't violate it. So can you outline what exactly the elements of economic sanction and how that allows ambiguity to play in the process? The second is again going back to the previous panel. That is, the realm of change on China's North Korean policy. From your readings of the think tanks, I mean the government inside conversation that we don't know, but in China online and in different formats, you'll be able to get enough of this scholarly think tank and government affiliated, different kinds of people making comments and writing about China's North Korean policy. Do you see some kind of pattern, the change in the recent few years?
Okay, great, Professor.
Okay, let me follow Bob Sutter's question here. We have seen a fierce change of China domestic debate on North Korean issue, and it becomes more and more open and more critical of North Korea. So how has this happened when you talk about leverage of China? And I still remember just 2 or 3 years ago when what's his name, Guofeng at Central Party School, he wrote that article to criticize North Korea. He was fired.
Yeah.
And ever since then, I see kind of changes, up and downs. Then at elite level, you see a lot more and more criticism of North Korean policy, and also on the internet, you have seen more and more opened up of those criticism of North Korea, and also asking for China to change policy toward North Korea. And eventually, you see that the divisions. Jia Qingguo, the Peking University professor, he eventually now calling to coordinate with the United States to prepare for the collapse of North Korean regime. And this article was personally attacked by Zhejiang province public security official, senior official, and even attacked Jia Qingguo as a treason, as a traitor, and said he was a American spy. He was trained in U.S. and he was on the U.S. embassy list. If there's anything happening in China, he will be rescued by the United States. And so it's a really personal, this kind of attacks and debate. But Jia Qingguo has not been touched. In fact, I asked Jia Qingguo last month, I asked him, why do you openly talk about this? I mean, you steal it. Why you do this? You brought trouble for yourself for the hot spot. He said, I talk so much internally, nobody listened to me. So finally I decided, and also he stopped the unfair change. So he could talk publicly, but he was attacked so personally. And, but this has been, there's an article just last week in China talking about the change debate environment on North Korea. Guofeng, all those people are talking very openly. Said, even see Jia Qingguo is attacked personally, nothing happened to him. Why? Why? And, but in the meantime, just last month or 2 months ago, there was a PhD student, graduate student at a Central Party School. And she published an article in Singapore, Press Street, it's Chinese language newspaper, the Street Times. She was fired a few months ago, fired again. So I see this kind of a very mixed signals from China. So I try to figure out what's going on there. From what I heard was at the elite level, they are opened up. Even Jia Qingguo, this kind of person, personally attacked, nothing happens to him. But at popular level, they still try to control the expression. So how do you take these changes into the understanding of China's language or China's policy change toward North Korea? Second, here, why this has happened? What is behind this? That's what I try to figure out. Internal dynamics, elite level, and policy making level, and those. Internally, I talked to them. They said internally they were very open for quite a while, and now they burst public. So how, why this happens?
Good questions. I think we have a two-finger interjection from Professor Womack.
Yeah, it seems to me that it have to distinguish between criticizing China's North Korea policy and trying to think about what China should do if the U.S. does something that's not controllable by China, some type of intervention. That's the way I read Jia Qingguo's article, that it's not so much a criticism of China's current policy, it's saying, something big might happen.
You can have
The collapse caused by U.S. So we.
No, he not said caused by U.S. That's
Well, yeah, no, he doesn't say that. I think that. Well, Daegu, I'm sure he said it.
no, here. That's people criticize actually because he's pro-America.
Yeah.
So the debate here is that the whole Korean issue is caused by U.S. That's those leftists, those conservatives.
Yeah.
All the troubles in Asia Pacific are caused by U.S. So he said, no, this is not U.S. issue. This is China issue. So a lot of that's my argument.
Right.
I took my credit in China. North Korea issue is not U.S. issue. It's China issue. So people, I don't think Jackie will blame U.S. That's why he's
But he said, what if it collapses? Shouldn't China have an alternative policy? And there's even some there's even some stuff on the ground in Jilin province.
Oh, that's a really article about nuclear disaster. What China should respond. I think those are local people making troubles. Jilin people, and that incident was another. China said Wulong event. Just like Hawaii, that the Japanese, the North Korean nuclear attack on Hawaii, you had the alarm came out, very similar.
Okay, in the interest of time, since we only have 5 to 10 more minutes, I saw a couple hands up on this side of the room. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Just to tag on some of the comments made earlier, I think it's interesting in itself to talk about, to analyze the scholarly domestic discussions, like some of the nuances just disclosed by Professor Zhao. But I feel we need to see a discussion on why do you think the scholarly discussions matter and how, in terms of the policy makers, the relationship between the policymakers and the scholarly opinions. And there are also things, as Professor Zhao said, the scholars have become more open about what they really think about the issue. But there are still things that they don't talk about in public. So analyzing their published work is going to give you the limitation on their real thinkings on this. And I have a minor question on one of the remarks you made during your talk. You said North Korea has lost its value in being a buffer zone long time ago because of the missiles.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean by that? I still feel it's still a buffer zone.
Some of the Chinese scholars mentioned it. Yeah, some of the Chinese scholars mentioned that the buffer zone is supposed to be, if it is not a ballistic missiles, then you have to fight. If something happens, if Korea is unified under the South Korea, for example, and if South Korea have the U.S. forces on their side, in the end, China has to confront the U.S. forces on the border, which is really undesirable for the Chinese government, and that's part of the reason why China doesn't want North Korea to collapse. That's a buffer zone. But then some people in China that argue that if something happens, the United States doesn't have to be there, but we can actually launch a ballistic missiles against China, or it's not actually a existing buffer zone, but it's imaginary buffer zone from the Chinese perspective.
So even for that argument, I would say there's no China on this, because there's debate inside China.
Right.
If North Korea is still a buffer zone, only those conservatives, those leftists, they argue that, make that argument. Even Guofeng, those people, scholars, they don't think it's buffer for China
So
anymore.
a very small number of people in China still talk about this buffer zone.
Right, very small number of people, yes.
Okay, and go ahead.
So I think I'm supportive of your main argument, but I also agree with Rana that to kind of strengthen your argument, you need something kind of beyond kind of like scholarly comments. So here might sound like two suggestions. Like one thing, so China already signed the UN resolution to sanction against North Korea, but on the other hand, you do see still a few like Chinese companies still like did not really follow that resolution. So I'm not sure, but maybe you can look for some of the evidence, I guess, and it's difficult, but maybe you can look for some evidence about like to what extent the Chinese government is unable to control those companies or unwilling, like if there's some limit of Chinese government to actually control those companies to trade with North Korea, that might become the limited leverage that Chinese government may have. And the other area to illustrate the limited leverage of China might be to what extent they can have the same relationship with Kim Jong-un, the current leader, compared to his father. Like Kim Jong-un may want to just have his own legacy, and like because of the lack of relationship with Chinese leader as his father did, and so he may not just listen to whatever, he may not listen to what Chinese government said. I know it might be very difficult for you to find evidence, but I think these are the two areas maybe can help you strengthen your argument.
Great. Okay. Eric, or yes.
So I wasn't going to ask this because I'm too depressed, but I will. Now, is there any evidence at all? I mean, I haven't seen any. I think the answer is no. And Shishang sort of outlined the Chinese position, which is this is all about American troublemaking and the instrumental use of the North Korea issue to do all these horrible things in Asia. But is there any evidence that anyone in China is thinking and acknowledging the second order effects of all this? That THAAD may in fact have been put in South Korea because they're worried about North Korean missiles, or that Japan is going to do Aegis ashore because of North Korean missiles, and that South Korea extended the range of its ballistic missiles to 800 kilometers because of North Korea, and that Japan might ultimately get nuclear weapons someday because of North Korea. I mean, is there any discussion of the horrifying ramifications of any of this? Any evidence of that discussion? And again, I think if you find it, I would imagine it would be in interviews rather than in
There are sort of discussions.
Okay.
Well, WeChat has some discussions
Yes.
on this.
There is
I don't know whether that's a reliable
systematic
source.
discussion on this.
Okay.
Chinese
Those.
scholars talk about all those stuff. Just like military still said it's America, it's against China. But a lot of intellectuals said no, it's not because of against China, it's just North Korea. Because North Korea got that problem.
So, okay. All right.
Okay, those were great comments and questions. Any others before we let HJ have a chance at? Okay, go ahead. Would you like to respond?
Yeah, well, it's more like a comment instead
Okay,
of the
great.
questions, but I know that there's some questions about this. I think what is important is that, as many of you have mentioned, that why is it important to look at the scholarly articles to make a judgment about the Chinese foreign policy? What is the connection between this Chinese foreign policy and the scholarly debate? Right? How important it is and how reflective it is into the Chinese foreign policy. I think it's one of the reasons why I did it is it's a preliminary research, and I wanted to see how this debate is going on and how the discussions are going on about North Korea. And what I found out is that it's pretty actually reflective of the Chinese foreign policy, although there's a small group of people who might make a strong argument, like as you mentioned, Jia Qingguo and other people, that might be not, their argument might not be running in line with the government policy. But if you look at this, a variety of the scholarly articles written by the scholars in general, I think that there's a clear line that reflects the Chinese foreign policy. So to that extent, I think it's important to look at it. Of course, Guofeng and Jia Qingguo and Yan Xuetong, they also talk about this, how to deal with China, how to deal with North Korea, for example. And they're more like a pro-economic sanction people, and they try to make an argument that China has to get involved in the North Korea problem more than before. And I think the Chinese government is taking seriously, actually, because of there's a growing number of people that are talking about this Chinese role in North Korea's problem. And the debate actually happened whether or not the China has to get involved more was actually in I think in 2004 or something, 2004 and 2003, after North Korea withdrew from the NPT and all that. and China started to think about whether or not it has to deal with it as is, or we have to get involved more. And that's a time when the China initiated the multilateral discussion and sort of the leading figure in the six-party talks, I guess. And at that moment, I think that there was a growing scholarly article that shows that China has to get involved more in dealing with North Korea. So I think it's sort of in line with the general the policy options that the Chinese government is choosing. So I think we should not just looking at one or two or several articles, but at the same time we have to look at a variety of articles written by not only these scholars but also the people who are working for what is it? It's a party school, right? There's a party school, central party school. So looking at, for example, Zhang Yangui, who is a party school professor who deals with North Korea, and he is very strongly talking about this importance of economic sanctions. And I think it's part of it, and then it also is a part of the North Korea's provocative actions. And China is actually implementing more seriously the economic sanctions these days. And in terms of, I think, it's a definition of the economic sanctions, I think it's something that we have to think about. To what extent do you mean by economic sanctions? Is it trade, or is it something economic? What is it? The flow of the goods and then investment and all that. And I think we have to think about in this way, right? Economic sanctions or negative economic sanctions are related to the positive economic sanctions. Once you give or allow these economic interactions to flow in, trade or investment flow in, and it could be used against North Korea in the future as a form of negative economic sanctions. So I think any type of form of economic activities could be regarded as economic sanctions because Inye also mentioned it and you also mentioned it. So that's I think pretty much about it. And thank you everybody for the comments.
Okay, great. And with that, we're going to move on to Joshua Eisenman is, he's the convener of this amazing conference, but he's also an assistant professor at the LBJ school, and he's a distinguished scholar. And he also has a very exciting book coming out, Red China's Green Revolution. And one of the things that I really like about this paper, aside from how good it is that it kind of marries nicely your focus on foreign policy and also domestic China. So look forward to hearing it.
Great. Well, thanks, Rana, and thanks for taking the time out of your day to be here. And maybe I could start off by thanking everybody for staying awake, staying involved, staying engaged, doing your part to help everybody else to improve their papers, right? And that's really the point of this. And I had these nightmares of coming to this and basically you hear crickets, right? And that's just not happened. People are getting engaged and involved in the discussions, and that's really what this is all about. So I want to thank everybody for taking time, flying here, and being a part of what we're doing here. So this paper actually grows out of Red China's Green Revolution. The initial draft of the book looked at the commune as a tripartite institution. It was political, it was economic, and it was military. The mean being the people's militia were the military component of it, and very little research recently has been done on them. And so I started to dig into the people's militia. What was their role? What was their goal? What did they do? And essentially they were, if you want to think of Plato, right, they were the guardians, right? They were the ideologically pure people in the commune who were fundamentally tasked with not only keeping security, but also promoting Maoism and being a very important component of the economic strategy of the commune as well. So in digging into them a little bit more, I began to kind of understand their role. And I also, as I kind of crept along in the book and got to the conclusion, I began looking at why did China get rid of the commune? And then I started seeing a lot of suspicious things, coincidences, right? I grew up watching Law and Order. And in Law and Order, whenever there are like a bunch of coincidences, people start to get curious, right? How could these coincidences? So let me lay out for you some of the coincidences which brought me to look at this. The first thing was that in developing the last chapter of the book, I began to look at factional struggle between the Hua faction, Hua Guofeng's faction, and Deng Xiaoping's faction. And one interesting thing that developed was that I could find comment after comment from Deng's faction about why the war needed to be fought. I have not found even one comment from anybody associated with Hua Guofeng's faction that says this war should be fought, including Hua Guofeng himself. Which is bizarre. You would think the chairman of the Communist Party is going to say, "Go get him, boys," right before the war. You don't find it at all. In fact, Hua Guofeng's comments are at best lukewarm. And this was curious to me. The timing of the decision. This decision was taken at the third plenum in December 1978. The same conference where they decided to basically get rid of the commune and launch economic reforms. And so this is a curious timing, right? You basically, at the minute you're having this massive political change, massive economic change, you also decide to get involved in this war. And that was an interesting timing that brought my attention. There are also comments by PLA senior generals, people like General Liu Yazhou and others, suggesting in comments in Chinese to the military that the primary goal of the war was to allow Deng Xiaoping to take over China. He says it very directly. And his brother, who is at the Carter Center, I sent him this speech and I said, just check this with your brother, make sure that this is really what he said. And he got back to me and said, yeah, this is what he said. And so then I took it, and General Xu, I met him in Beijing, and I said, hey, this is what General Liu Yazhou said. Do you agree? He said, 100%. That's exactly why. And so this began to be very curious. Now, we've got senior PLA generals saying that this is that domestic politics is playing a role, so I began to become increasingly interested. And then you begin to look at things like what happens after the war, which is this purging of Maoist generals, purging of People's War Strategy, a hard move away into a military modernization. And then just to compound all this, you've got the secrecy that surrounds this war in China, right? This is not something that can be discussed openly. And it was very hard for me to, nobody would talk to me about this except for this general who is known as being pretty outspoken. And so that got me curious too. And the final point that I couldn't quite understand is that if anybody understood the PLA and its weaknesses and said them publicly, it was Deng Xiaoping. So he called them what? Fat, stupid, and unable to fight a war, and then he deploys them into a war. So it's a very curious set of events where you would say these guys can't fight and then send them to fight, and they go, oh my gosh, they lost, I'm so surprised. So all of these things kind of combined to make me curious about the causes of the war. And I began to look at the literature, which is predominantly about international causes of the war. And in the paper I list the four primary causes. China's concern about the invasion of Kampuchea, China's concern about this relationship between Vietnam and Russia and the Soviet Union, China's desire to increase rapprochement with the United States, as is mentioned in Gates's book. And so there's a variety of issues, but they're all international. And so this began, I started to say, well, of course, as a political scientist, I'm trained to think that all things are multivariable, multi-causal. What about the domestic? And I went looking for it, and it's really hard to find. You find only a few people who even mention the domestic politics, and nobody suggests that Deng Xiaoping actually fought this war for this reason, although the furthest anyone will go is to say that he used it later to his advantage. And so, I began to want to dig into a little bit of the development process. Now, in doing this, at that point, Kathy was still at UT, and she was a Brumley Fellow at Strauss Center. And so her and I began to talk, and she, did some great research and helped me find some, theoretical questions about the domestic causes of military intervention, and I began to poke around. Now, those are in the paper. But part of me I want to ask you guys if I should leave them there. Like, is this theoretical section even necessary, or is it better to rip it out and just talk directly about the war? I left it in there in part because I wanted to get your thoughts about that. But I guess, getting into the paper very, quickly in the remaining time I have, essentially you have what is known as the two-line struggle. The struggle between the people who support an ideological military, a low-cost people's war strategy, a mean being, a military which is strongly associated with the people's militia, which is linked to this idea of rural bases, which then thwart the enemy's ability to move within China. People's war strategy is a defensive strategy, period. It's a low-cost defensive strategy that was perfected during the Mao era in order to defend China and to, eventually to win China and then to defend China in case of invasion. And then you have a military modernization line. And in fact, these debates go back to the 20s and 30s to some degree. So they're long-standing debates within the party. When Peng Dehuai becomes the head of the military, he begins to do things which are very similar to military modernization. When Peng Dehuai is purged and Lin Biao is put in, he gets rid of all of that. And he prints these little red books and he brainwashes everybody ideologically into believing in Maoism, and then uses the Ming Bing at the local level to basically brainwash every single village into Maoism. And this kind of idea known as support the left, that the military is going to be an advocate of the left, this went on until the early 70s, until we have what I would call the rise of military modernization. We see a reduction in the amount of PLA in senior political roles, and we see an increase in this idea that China is going to modernize its military. Although People's War generals were still in very senior positions, and the People's War strategy was still the official strategy, and it was pervasive. So you had and I talk about it in the paper, mentions of military modernization, but it's not the primary line yet. Not until the factional struggle begins. And Deng Xiaoping is very clearly associated with Peng Dehuai. He's clearly associated with this military modernization strand within the party. And so the Vietnam War then, for me, in terms of its domestic role. Now, what I'm not saying, I want to be clear, is that international factors didn't play a role. They did. They most definitely did. There's no doubt about it. And so that's not the debate that I'm having. What I'm trying to do, if anything, is just try to complete the discussion a little more by adding a domestic component. And so when we look at the war and its primary causes, or its primary outcomes, I would say one of the most important outcomes of the war was that it clearly and publicly got Ye Jianying's support for Deng Xiaoping. Ye Jianying had supported Hua Guofeng's taking out of the Gang of Four when Deng Xiaoping himself was out of power. But Deng and Ye have a long-standing history together. But the question was, you had this kind of triumvirate at the top at that moment. Hua, Deng, and Ye as the head of the military. How do you get Ye to be completely on the side, or at least make a public determination? In a lot of ways, it comes down to the guns versus butter debate that this war encapsulates. You had Hua Guofeng advocating in 1978 a commune-first approach. His February 1978 10-year plan says double down on the commune. Dajai for the whole. He's very clear about that. Supportive of that kind of Maoist structure. And then you have Deng Xiaoping supporting a very different approach. And how do you get Ye Jianying to make a hard decision? Well, I think that is the fundamental use of this war. You get Ye Jianying, who's a military man, who's a marshal, who believes in that you actually need to modernize the military, suffered during the Cultural Revolution. You get him on your side by basically giving a guns versus butter debate. Hua Guofeng says, spend more on development, spend more on modernization, keep a balanced budget. Deng Xiaoping says, actually, we can spend less on development, we need to increase consumption-led growth, and we need to fight this war, we need to modernize our military. And so, for me, that's the kind of fundamental political role of the war, is it very clearly pulls Ye Jianying onto Deng Xiaoping's side in this factional struggle, which means you get the military on your side, which means game over. And it's pretty clear that after the decision to fight this war, the factional struggle is over. Now, one could say that there are many things going on, not only this, to be sure, but why would Ye finally support Deng? To me, the military and the role of the military, more funding for the military, seems to be critical in terms of his decision-making process and the timing of that process. Again, it's tough here. Ye does not make many comments on this war, right, publicly. So it's really hard, and there's a lot of tea leaf reading here. If anybody's seen any comments he makes either way, I would love to see it. So essentially we have this change. Now, there's also one other suspicious thing. Deng Xiaoping does not achieve the victory of the war that he claimed he wanted at the beginning. He pulls out early, almost like in the Vietnam case with the platform, right? He does not achieve the goals he set forward. Yet he declares success afterwards, as he did with the platform. And so, what success was he talking about? Was the success in terms of the U.S.? Was the success in terms of winning the struggle? I would argue both. But what it could not be is a success in Vietnam. China did not win this war. So to claim success is dubious at best. Again, I'm trying to figure out finally whether or not I think Deng Xiaoping did this on purpose. And I have to say at this point in this room, I do believe he did. My personal view at this point is that Deng Xiaoping knew what he was doing and did it on purpose. He fought a war with a military that couldn't fight that war. And he knew it, and he made public statements saying that before he fought the war. And then after the war, he undoubtedly deployed the failure in the war to purge his political enemies. That we know for sure. So it seems to me that at least circumstantially, there's good reason to believe he did. That being said, I'm seeing Brantley giving me the stink eye, so I think that there's plenty of people who may disagree with me. But I want to put that out there for Chris for the middle of discussion. Thanks.
Okay, that was great. I will just make my short points because I think yours, Eric, are going to be much more useful, so I'll just get mine out of the way. You kind of answered the first one about Deng's concerns about the war not being successful and your very vivid language of the fat and stupid PLA.
That's his language, actually.
Okay. And then, but I think you started to touch on this, but the war is unsuccessful, the consequences of that, the larger repercussions that he may have had to then deal with. And then I would have liked to hear just a little bit more on leadership decision-making, the processes. I noted that you started to talk about it a little bit, but I just thought there could be a little more on that. And then the timing and everything, you nicely draw out how this really does seem to be important as a domestic driver, but what about any domestic arguments against, at least briefly addressing that would then strengthen your argument? Okay, with that, Eric's hand was up first, then Professor Zhao.
Yeah, okay, so when you first told me about this was months ago, I was a little bit skeptical in general, but I really like the paper, I like where it's going, I think there's a core here. It's an important argument, it'll make a big splash. I wouldn't be too ambitious about how you frame it. So first of all, it just made personal taste. I don't think the theory does a lot for you up front, so I would lose that. The other thing is I would probably lose the argument against the realist. I just wouldn't go there. I think your most effective setup is, look, there are these arguments, let's be aware of them, but on the other hand, nobody's addressed potential domestic causes, and you have to understand the domestic context in which this is taking place. You also have a couple of great sort of smoking gun data points, with Guofeng not supporting the war. I didn't know that. So that's great. I think you've got enough here to work from. You don't have to compete these two explanations or prove anything. And you do open yourself up because the Soviets had to use a technical term, a shit ton of divisions on the border, and they were pretty good. And the CIA's estimate was China couldn't defend itself against the Russians. So all that. I just wouldn't argue against it. There are a couple of for lack of a better word, factual issues with the paper. So I think it's going to take some adjustment. So 2 lines, I'm not sure, maybe modernization was the term, but modernization is not a, so People's War and Guerrilla War, these are names for strategies. Modernization is not a name for strategy, it's something you do. So this is about conventional war, right, and the place of conventional war, conventional operations within a larger defense strategy. So that's kind of the debate. And you mentioned the budget, that this was guns versus butter. Well, I would also kind of lose that. It was about the structure of the military. So the strength of the argument is there's a debate about doctrine, and the doctrine is tied to the polity and governance as you say, the communes, it's tied to how you think about how the country should be governed, and that in turn affects the effectiveness, the combat effectiveness of your strategy, et cetera, et cetera. So all these things are tied together, the economics, the governance, and the military strategy. But it wasn't about guns versus butter. So, after Deng won this round, after he won this argument, military budgets went down. So, up to this point, the PLA at this point was 4.5 million strong. And, ultimately, today it's 2.3 million. And Deng made the biggest cuts. The first increments were some of the biggest. So military budgets went down pretty dramatically as a percentage of GDP. They also went down a number of years in absolute terms. Of the four modernizations, military modernization was the fourth, was dead last. I think that changed years later, but it wasn't for a long time. And in fact, if you look at the debate in 1996 over the national security law, it was pretty clear this pent-up frustration of the military with lack of budgets. So among other things, one of the things that Deng did is he authorized the military to run businesses. So yeah, they kind of got out of the communes, but he let them run hotels and brothels and lots of other unsavory businesses, basically to support themselves and kill time, while he was working on other aspects of modernization, right? So I would frame it in guns versus butter, and then maybe another big point is this was the first round, so you make it as the final victory. But you yourself said this debate goes back to the 1920s. Here we're in 1978. We've got 4.5 million men in the military. Of those, like 4.45 million didn't know how to run a conventional war. So it's kind of not intuitively clear why everybody would sort of say, oh, great, okay, now we're doing conventional war. So the advocates of people's war, just they dug down deep. They were the deep state of China, and they maintained their position. And when Deng became vulnerable later, they came out in force. So, the military launched a number of campaigns that marginalized Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang. These were the original advocates of People's War. These were true believers in People's War. They were particularly strong in particular institutions like the General Political Department. And I could go through all the campaigns they launched. The theory of soldiers' gains and losses, the drums of Mao going, and all this stuff. And these concentric attacks on the vulnerable liberals. So it didn't end there. It was the first round, and they came back several times to sort of threaten Deng and his legacy. And I'm sorry. And then I'm sorry. Just as a piece of evidence, I'm not sure I would use. So again, you've got a ton here. I'm not sure that the competing the different explanations that Deng gave for the war are the best evidence. Of course, he's going to give one set of explanations to the rest of the world, to the external world, and he may acknowledge other effects of the war internally. And you might point that out, but I wouldn't use that as evidence of a secret intent. You've got lots of other things there to work with. So again, just big picture, I think it's great. It's very compelling, but it needs some adjustment. Sorry for going on so long, but
no, thanks.
I got interested, obviously.
Yeah, that's good.
I really like this research. I think if you can prove the internal politics, internal power struggle was the primary cause, or one of the primary causes, because there, as you said, multiple causes, that would be a major contribution for the study of Chinese foreign policy, especially in this kind of situation, military policy making, because as you said, we have not seen many of these researchers. I would say even I have not seen any of them well done. So this would be the first well done research on the domestic side of, because people always argue that the foreign policy extension of domestic politics, especially talking about war, is something domestic, diversion of domestic issues or something. Here, you argue about the power struggle. But here, as I think Eric addressed the question, I would follow on that question here. Because people have been debating about China's policy-making arena. There are two types of struggles. One is purely, you say, line struggles. that is Chinese 路线斗争, meaning the policy differences, the struggle here, talk of people's war versus modern warfare type of policy differences. Second is a purely power struggle, using policy for the purely power struggle purpose. Here I would argue that all from what you presented looks to me like that it's more kind of power struggle than the policy struggle. Even we talk about Guofeng versus Deng Xiaoping, there is some years ago, people talk about these two people have policy differences. Deng Xiaoping wanted to have more left, the rightist market-oriented policy, and Guofeng was more Maoist. But then many researchers now have proved on policy issues, these two people have a lot of agreements, more agreements than differences. So in that context, people have argued that Guofeng and Deng Xiaoping's struggle was not policy struggle. Tibbs was his in Australia. He has several good articles talking about the policy agreements between these two. I think he did not talk about military policy. I don't know if we can find there's kind of research on that part. As you said, Guofeng did not talk about a lot. But so I will not see the many policy differences. Even you bring Ye Jianying into this picture. In fact, Ye Jianying has such good relationship with Deng Xiaoping from very beginning. It's not because Deng Xiaoping is going to, as you said, to bring more military resources to the military. Ye Jianying came to him. That's not the case. When Guofeng came back to, launched the coup d'etat, Deng Xiaoping was already under protection of Ye Jianying in Guangzhou already. So these two people were buddies from the very beginning. So it's not because of policy put them together, because brotherhood, because they just support each other. That's what Ye Jianying and Deng Xiaoping's relationship. So here I see your argument is that Deng Xiaoping used this war to consolidate his power. Although it's eventually a failure from a military perspective, but he proved that he was there to launch a war to defend national interests. In this case, at that time, so many kind of pictures about how humiliated China was by Vietnam to send all those Chinese Vietnamese cross border, all those Vietnam working with the Soviet Union. All those kind of stories give people a sense China was in trouble. So he proved he was able military leader. That's what people talk about Deng Xiaoping. Because why he defeated Guofeng? Because he had connections in the military. He was in the 3rd Field Army. He was all the time in the military. He had a military background. Guofeng did not have it. Guofeng was only 团长, the division commander, while Deng Xiaoping was a field army commander already. So this type of power aspect eventually led Deng Xiaoping to make decision other than international factors from domestic perspective. The power, I can use this to consolidate my power, can win support. So I think that's the argument I would argue. More than policy differences.
Very helpful. It's nice to get so many thoughtful comments.
I just had kind of a parallel comment. I would probably tend to agree with Eric that theory was not so useful for me at the front. But insofar as you could make this like war-making helps state-making argument or weave that into your analysis of the kind of the history of the war that you've done, that I think could be really value added to an already really interesting piece.
Okay. I see professors. Let's go with Professor Womack and then Professor Sun.
Go first, please.
I think that the argument's very interesting. I think maybe you need to differentiate between the the pattern of hostility between China and Vietnam that developed from 1976 to 1979, and the act of going to war. When I interviewed the Chinese ambassador to Vietnam during that period, he was opposed to the war because he had lots of friends in Vietnam, and then he was called to Beijing and roundly criticized by Deng Xiaoping. He was called a cracker.
That's very
So, if you look at the deterioration of Chinese-Vietnamese relations from 76 to 79, if you look at the concomitant increase in Chinese relations with Cambodia at the time that the relations with Vietnam and Cambodia are deteriorating, clearly this is not happening because of Deng Xiaoping's rise, because he's sinking first and then rising slowly during this period. So what you're really doing is trying to explain the onset of war rather than the process of hostility. And that's one way of finessing the question. Right now you have it, you're setting up this, here's what everybody says, I'm going to tell you the real inside story. And you've got a big credibility gap for people that know the history of the relationship. More particularly, though, I'm not so sure about the chronology of your timing, because Deng Xiaoping was basically, that the third plenum was the victory march for Deng Xiaoping. So it wasn't like he had to defeat Guofeng after that. So, I mean, you see the whole course of the practice is the only criterion for determining truth campaign from May 78 on, and you do have the building up of a series of important, and public conflicts with Vietnam, culminating in Vietnam joining the Warsaw Pact in late November, early December 78, and the invasion of Cambodia on December 26. So you have a lot of causes of war building up, and the domestic question is more maybe an enabling question. Perhaps if Guofeng were still a kind of weak transitional government were in charge, it wouldn't be able to take that decision. But then let's look at the decision itself. Deng Xiaoping was very worried about those Soviet divisions up there. So he wanted to do a limited strike on Vietnam with the justification of Vietnamese territorial claims or territorial incursions in Chinese territory. The official reason for the war was territorial incursions by Vietnam. So what he did was attack on 5 of the 6 provinces, and he doesn't want to attack on the 6th border province, because the 6th border province is Guangning province, and the capital, the provincial capital is way down, so that would be a major attack. So he does an attack on these 5 provinces, and as soon as the last capital, Lansong, is captured, he starts to retreat. So it's a limited action. Now, the problem with it was that, Kaohsiung, Lansong, anyway, provincial capitals.
Now, just a couple of questions of fact here. My understanding was they didn't capture it; they bombarded it and then left. That they didn't that the provincial capitals were in sight, and they were hitting them with artillery, and then they retreated. But that's a question of fact of the war. I don't, but I'm not sure.
When I visited them, they were destroyed.
Yeah.
I didn't see any graffiti.
Yeah.
It established that the military had been there. And of course, the loss of life was certainly a sign that the military needed modernization. But remember also that in the the 4 modernizations, military modernizations, the last one. Mm-hmm. And that was the funding decision too. So if it's gun versus butter, it's butter, gun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now the issue here of the forces on the border, I want to push back gently, if I may. So if we take some kind of thinking about from a military strategy perspective. You're China, you're weak, you've got your People's War Army, and you've got these divisions on the border. Why would you attack south and put yourself at risk of an attack from the north? I mean, from any realist thinking, that is madness. If you truly think that this agreement between the Vietnamese and the Soviets is legitimate, then attacking the Vietnamese is asking for a Soviet attack. So to me, I think that that argument actually goes to the domestic politics side, because from any realist perspective, why, if you're a poor backward state with the People's War Army, get yourself into a two-front war where the fronts are not even close to each other? So this is you know, and again, you guys I think know the history better than I do, but it seems to me that the bigger the threat from the Soviets, the more deterrence to a war, not the more possibility of getting into one. So it seems like that would suggest.
The two things that show Deng's awareness of this are, first of all, that he goes to Washington in January, tells the U.S. about it, makes sure that the U.S. is going to be neutral to it, and certainly not, you know, and then he also gives pretty good advice on the Soviets and, you know, that type of preparedness. And the second thing is, he announces a limited purpose in the war. He's not going to be taking Hanoi. Hanoi is 100 miles from that border.
Yeah.
Now, if he went another province deep, if he went to the top 2 provinces in Vietnam, there's about 51 provinces at that time, then he would be threatening the regime, the Hanoi regime. And that would be something I think that would trigger the Soviet involvement. But it's short. He pulls out, he calls it a lesson, not officially, but later on, and he threatens a second lesson, and always matches Vietnamese activities in Cambodia with artillery attacks on the border. So, you know, it's not intended to be a military victory. It's intended to be a military cost to Vietnam and distraction from their southern activities in Cambodia.
You know, I think it's really fascinating that you spoke to the ambassador, the Chinese ambassador, and the Chinese ambassador told you he was against the war and then got criticized for
our mutual friend told me he was against the war.
I still think that's an interesting point. Because
didn't he lose his job?
I assume he lost his job. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And then to have him be criticized by Deng Xiaoping, that fits very nicely, if it's true, if your friend is accurate, very nicely into the story I'm telling. And what would need to do is I need to find out who this person is and see if he has anything connection with Hua Guofeng, right? Because that would be a statement, or at least hearsay statement, against the war by a supporter of Hua Guofeng, if this person was indeed a supporter, and that would then be a very helpful
There's no doubt that there were differing opinions on whether or not it was a good idea, whether or not it would be a good idea before it happened, and whether or not it had been a good idea after it happened, especially considering the losses. You know, whether or not whether this is, I certainly don't think it was a diversionary war from political machinations.
Last question on this point. Did you get the sense that this division of views was, as I said, based on political lines, right? That the Hua Guofeng faction opposed, Deng Xiaoping faction support. Is that factually correct?
I don't know. I don't think of Hua Guofeng as having much of a constituted faction, including with the Minbin. Because the Minbin, when I heard about Minbin politics in 1976, it was because the Gang of Four had gotten some Minbin support, and people were really worried about there being some military action.
So they tried to mobilize 100,000 in Shanghai. So their problem was they didn't leave Beijing, and you know, when they got rounded up.
But the Tiananmen Square in 1976, they mobilized Beijing.
Oh, right.
Yeah, huge amount.
Okay, Professor Sutter?
This is another tangent. I'm a Ye Chen Ying fan, and I have a series of vignettes which I want to share with you because, and maybe some of you know there's been things written about Ye Chen, but I don't know about these. Number one, after the purge in the State Department in the early Cold War, Walter Robertson was the Assistant Secretary of State. He was interviewed by Ye Jianying, who spent a lot of time in the Yan'an mission with the United States. He was in the working group that worked with the United States. And he had the highest regard of Ye Jianying. You know, he said, I can't think of the thing he said, but the last thing he said, he never lied to me. And this is Walter Robertson, a real hard liner. Okay, fast forward. In July of 1971, Henry Kissinger gets a stomachache in Pakistan and he goes to Beijing. Now we all know that Lin Biao will be dead in 6 weeks. He lands in Beijing, and who greets him? Ye Jianying. Now that one has never been explained to me. I mean, why would Ye Jianying be there? And I have images of the Godfather saying, "Stay with me, you're safe." Okay, my boss, Bill Whitson, goes with Schlesinger to, this is Energy Secretary Schlesinger, Defense Secretary Schlesinger, in 1976, Mao's dying, and they meet with Ye Jianying, and he's using a Mao quote, I forget which one it was, and one of his aides said, oh sorry, it's he said, oh, I don't give a shit about that. You know, just didn't care about that stuff. And so the bottom line here is this, but it's particularly his position in July of 1971 that I really am struck with. I just find that quite remarkable. And then once Lin Biao, and just a small correction, once Lin Biao is gone, when he's gone, as you put it, its representation, national level policy organs was reduced significantly. Yeah, they arrested the high command. They were reduced, all right.
Yeah.
They were put in the slammer. And so it makes you remember the searing struggles that were going on, and this was for keeps in so many of these different things. And you know what we've been talking about in the contemporary period is really small potatoes compared to this kind of just awful life and death kind of struggle.
Yeah, and that's why I don't think you need guns and butter, because it was about much more than
blood and blood.
These people had really suffered. So the advocacy for a conventional war strategy was small, but they were the heads of, among other things, any of the technical services. The Air Force hadn't had a commander in 15 years. The Navy had a shadow command, so what was it? Yeah. So he was technically the commander, but he had no authority. And he actually was, right in the midst of this cabal that got ready to arrest the Gang of Four, and so there was a lot of movement on that side. But basically, people had picked sides a long time before this, and they picked sides on the basis of, if Maoism continues and we continue down this track, whether it's with Mao or not, but certainly with the same doctrine and the same ideology, we're going to wind up in jail or dead, and the military's going to wind up gutted. And all the school systems were closed, the military educational system was gutted, everything except the nuclear programs and a couple of technical.
What year is this?
I mean, through the Cultural Revolution.
Another player, other than Ye Jianying, Li Xiannian is another very important player during that period. So you might want to look at Li Xiannian's role during that period. Because he then became the president of China, Li Xiannian. And in fact, he also can talk to Li Yaowei, because Li Yaowei's brother is the husband of Li Xiannian's daughter.
Ah, right.
And Li Xiaoling is the daughter of Li Xiannian. And so the difference between Li Xiannian and Ye Jianying is, as Bob said, Ye Jianying is a very decent military officer, marshal. But Li Xiannian is Chinese said, 土鳖子. He could not eat any Western food. He came to Washington complain all the time. So he's very different. So talking about policy issues there.
I really like this idea that was mentioned about the onset of war, because I think that a lot of international explanations help us to understand the context of war. What was going on kind of behind the scenes to make war possible, but why war at that moment? And I think that is perhaps how I need to frame this, right? Why did the confluence of events actually spark? So, you're talking about like the gas and the dynamite in the room in the IR side, and then what I'm talking about is the spark that lights that fuse and then begins to...
Why could it happen? Why did it happen? And what happened afterwards?
Yeah.
Why I brought the Hyon in? Because he was the Minister of Finance, Treasury. So money, if he have spent money, he was person in control.
Yeah.
Okay, any other comments or questions? Do you want to say anything more?
Well, I mean, thanks for everything, guys. I mean, I think, you know, this has been really great and really helpful, and I especially just knowing that I should cut that theory part is really big. But in terms of framing, I really appreciate it. Maybe I can just thank everybody for coming, for putting in the time. It's been a long day. It's martini time. Sam and I are going to have dinner tonight, and we're going to email folks and kind of we're going to go over our thinking as well. It's fresh, and then we're going to email everyone and kind of let you know what the next steps are in the project. Yeah, so I guess that's all. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.